To hear the full episode, become a patron at patreon.com/deathpanelpod.
Welcome to the Death Panel. Patrons, thank you so much for supporting the show. None of the work that we do would be possible without you. To become a supporter of Death Panel and get access to the second weekly bonus episode, as well as the entire back catalog of bonus episodes, become a patron at patreon.com/deathpanelpod. And to help us out some more, share the show with your friends, post about your favorite episodes, pick up copies of Health Communism, A Short History of Transmisogyny, and Abolish Rent at your local bookstore, or request them at your local library, and follow us at deathpanel_. I'm Beatrice Adler-Bolton, and my guest today is Kate Brown. Kate is a historian and author. She is a professor in the history of science at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, and is the founding editor of History Unclassified, a section of the American Historical Review. She's also the author of several books, including Manual for Survival, An Environmental History of the Chernobyl Disaster, Plutopia, Nuclear Families, Atomic Cities, and the Great Soviet and American Plutonium Disasters. And I've also asked her on the show to talk about her most recent book, published in February, called Tiny Gardens Everywhere, The Past, Present, and Future of the Self-Provisioning City. Kate, welcome to the Death Panel. Thank you so much for joining me.
Thanks for having me, Beatrice.
I'm really excited to talk about this book. I think what you've done here is a really great materialist history of how in the imperial core, food systems, ecology, and provisioning are really crucial lenses of analysis for how to understand and analyze power, survival, labor discipline, social reproduction, and the production of life itself. And the book, I think, importantly challenges the dominant story that modernity, quote unquote, and industrial agriculture in Europe and the United States are what made cities livable, and instead foregrounds and asserts the importance of the sometimes invisible and sometimes invisibilized practices of communal self-provisioning. And there's a long history of this, particularly the land stewardship and food forests of indigenous people, for example. But the dominant story goes that without industrialized agriculture, large-scale farming, and centralized systems of mass distribution, that cities would essentially collapse into hellish landscapes of scarcity, disease, and social disorder.
Right.
But you walk readers through histories that demonstrate alongside, underneath, and against these systems, working class and poor people have always been building something else for each other. Dense, improvised, ingenious collective provisioning that not only made life possible, but made it clean and safe and beautiful and bountiful. And in the book, you trace how people pushed off land through enclosure, migration, settler colonialism, and racial capitalism, took their deep and extensive knowledge and seeds and techniques and relationships and used that to build forms of life-making in the margins of urban space. Whether that's vacant lots, embankments, alleys, backyards, these all became sites of production, experimentation, and care. And I think what emerges from your account is a recognition that some of the most productive, resilient, and ecologically sophisticated forms of agriculture are actually small-scale, collective, and embedded in everyday living. At the same time, the book is also really clear that these practices have never been just left alone. Again and again, we see how states, planners, and elites, the ruling class and owning class, intervene, sometimes in the name of improvement, sometimes in the name of health, sometimes in the name of property value, and sometimes leveraging the language of law, order, and beauty to discipline, to contain, or to just wholesale eliminate these forms of life-making. Whether it's the enclosure of the commons in England, the regulation of allotments, the policing of blight, or the imposition of lawns as a kind of racialized aesthetic order, what's at stake here is not just like land use, right? It's about whether people can sustain themselves outside of the market, whether they can reduce their dependence on wage labor, and whether they can build forms of collective life that exceed the logics of profit and control. That's all to say that, yes, this is a book about gardens, but it's more a history of working class autonomy and state repression. And this conversation, I hope, can move across those terrains today, from the histories you tell in the book to the conceptual frameworks to the political stakes of all this in the present. You know, we can talk about the body as ecology, about gardens as sites of resistance, but also discipline and the long history of attempts to sever people from the means of sustaining themselves, and about what it might mean to take these practices seriously as part of a different kind of urban future. So to start us off today, I'd really appreciate, Kate, if you just situate the project for listeners who haven't yet had a chance to read the book. You know, this is such a rich text. It moves across continents, across centuries, bringing together environmental and labor history, political economy, accounts of the lived experience of interdependent survival and care, both historical, contemporary, and your own experiences. I wish we could talk about all of it, but there's no way we'd be able to do that in the time that we have today. So at the top here, can you just lay out what the project of this book as a whole is and how you would describe, the offering of the book, both in terms of a historical intervention that you're trying to make and also the political imagination that you're clearly trying to open up for folks? What do you hope the book can do in terms of shifting how people understand the cities they live in, the food systems they're a part of, ecology, power, and also our own bodies?
Yeah, thanks for that introduction. That really very cogent interpretation of this book in your introduction. And for the questions, this book is called Tiny Gardens Everywhere, and that's exactly what it's about. It's about people coming together to self-provision on little tiny, a half acre here, a tiny spot of land there, maybe 10 acres on some edge of the city. And what they do when they come together in these tiny gardens is they shift the narrative from one of scarcity. And the narrative of scarcity works in the capitalist mindset. And also, I think, in the state paternalistic mindset that you're never going to have enough. You're never going to get there enough. You have to work harder. You have to be obedient, pay attention, etc. But the narrative of bounty changes everything. And that's where the gardens come in, that people in cities are moving from the countryside. And in the countryside, they usually were enclosed from common land. And that's a trajectory that continues to this day. Private property was something that was the English invented and spread across the world in the 18th century, and they really doubled down in the 19th century. And they shifted English peasants off of 6 million acres of land from 1750 to 1850. And these villagers had a sense of common land and common law. Common law meant that you had rights to food, fuel, and shelter. And common land meant that you could use, you had one shepherd who took care of all the animals in the village in the pasture. You had forests where people provisioned for their fuel and for small game and mushrooms and herbs. And the fields were basically worked in common. That shared the risk. If everybody had land up high and land down low, then during periods of drought or excessive rain, everybody did okay. So as they move into cities, they retain this understanding of the commons. And they go to the edge of the cities and they're like, look, no one's using this land. And around Berlin in the 1870s, that land was sand dunes because Berlin had been surrounded by wetlands. State officials had dried them out. Farmers had exhausted the soils and destroyed them and abandoned them, leaving basically sand dunes. So the gardeners went out and they would rent what would become a Berlin city block collectively, like 30 households. And they would divide up the land into almost exactly equal portions. And then they'd build a tiny house in the middle and start gardening around it. And they get some chickens, maybe some pigs, rabbits. It's not easy to grow anything on sand. But they were in a city, and cities are like the river Nile. They bring in a wash of organic nutrients from all over the world. Sugar beets from Ukraine, wheat from the American West, beef from Argentina. And, you can take, and that's what many of the elites did, take that garbage and throw it in the waterways and make a stinking mess. Or you could do what the working class gardeners did. They were like, don't throw that out, I'll take it. And so they would collect, sugar beet pulp and beer mash and food scraps and animal and human manure, and they would put it on the compost pile where it would heat up to 170 degrees, killing off all the pathogens, and then they'd have this gorgeous tilth. Now, this was something that farmers outside of Berlin didn't have access to. And this tilth made all the difference. Starting from really good soils, you can see it almost like stopgap photography, photographs that I found in the archives. You can see these little sandy gardens turning into this, better and then better. And they would plant, grapevines and fruit trees and nut trees. And by 1890, the infrastructure is more botanical than it is human generated. Like you can barely see the shacks because they're covered with vines and trees and just bounty. And with that bounty, people started to do more. So they were, they're in these collectives, about 30 households, and they would elect a council. And then they'd have some problems. Like, it's the summer, the kids don't have anything to do. So, well, let's start a children's summer camp. Some people are coming in with tuberculosis. So they built a shack on the margins and quarantined, build their own little sanatorium for people who were suffering from infectious illnesses. Neighbors would have disputes, so they set up an arbitration court. Neighbors would have their shacks would burn down, or people would get an injury on the job and be out of work. So they set up funds for fire insurance and workmen's compensation. Now we think of Germany as the country that first set up the social welfare state. It's attributed to like Otto von Bismarck in the 1890s. But what I found interestingly enough is that this first sinews of the social welfare network were being created in these green shanty towns without the help of the professional elite, worked out by people through these mutual aid societies and built with their own hands. And so I think that's something we have to think about as you talked about, Beatrice, about, alternative imaginaries. Eventually, the professional elite took notice of these green shantytowns, which they called barakia, like just barracks. And they would go, like in what I think is the first instances of ghetto tourism. They'd go to these green shantytowns and they would look around and they wrote about it and they'd say, these places are idyllic. They love them. And people like, Ebenezer Howard gets wind of them. And he proclaims something called a garden city, that people should move outside of cities on the margins and have their own gardens and produce for themselves, and that this would create, prosperity and abundance. What these professional elite did by stealing notions of the Social Security state, of garden cities, not only was it unethical, but it robbed from the rest of us the understanding that these so-called utopias were actually existing at the time, that these were things that thrived on the margins, on the working class margins of cities all over Europe and North America.
I think one of the things that's such an important thread running through the book is not just the reframing of the kind of bottom-up origins of collective provisioning, but also you make an important reframe of the human body in relationship to all of the other organisms that we are interdependent with, right? You push back against the idea that each of us is a kind of sealed, bounded, autonomous unit, asserting that we're instead an intertwined, incredibly porous ecological assemblage, right? A vast and relationally specific ecology of microorganisms. As you put it right at the beginning of the book, quote, "Human bodies merge with the larger ecologies in which they live. Humans are in the thick of nature." And I think for some people, that idea can be really deeply unsettling. As upsetting and destabilizing as the idea that we were all interdependent, especially in the context of a culture that is so invested in control and fantasies of purity and separation from the soil and separation from each other. And these are, of course, all ideas that are also, really important undergirding concepts to ableism and eugenic notions of the fit and the unfit, of being able to both separate ourselves from plants and to reduce the many ways that our bodies and minds exist to a kind of gross simplification downstream of a metaphor inspired by the breeding and selection of peas. Anyway, I'm curious to hear you speak about how you think about the discomfort that understanding sort of inspires in people and what it reveals about the kind of subjects that capitalism and the modern state desire and often require us to be. Because I think what's important is to think about what shifts politically when we stop imagining ourselves as sealed off individual units separate from nature and start thinking about ourselves as in the thick of it, as you said, sort of inseparable from so many thousands of ongoing interdependent processes and forms of life. And when we think and talk about, the kind of modern and labor histories of Europe and the United States, we don't often talk about the kind of specific relationality of bodies to the environment. We're often talking about bodies in relation to each other in specific locales of employment, right? And of one industry to another. But what I think is important is you sort of forego that level of relationality to focus instead on the relationship that bodies and bacteria and viruses and other microorganisms and animals and plants all have to each other, and the kind of importance of that relationship actually being sort of what makes us human, not the dominant idea of like the rational mind and enlightenment, right?
Right. Yeah, I mean, speaking of the Enlightenment, I mean, that's where we have these dualistic notions between mind and body, culture and nature, urban and rural. And you see in the 19th and 20th centuries this movement of urban spaces from, eradicating, especially after Pasteur and the understanding of pathogenic bacteria, that you have to move, dirt and animals and blight and bacteria out of the cities. And with it, anybody who might be carrying pathogens or might be a threat to the sanitation, the hygienic qualities of the city. And so it comes at a time, we start to separate the human body from all the other organisms that are part of the human body in our imagination, in part because of gene theory, but also in part because we're starting to spread a lot of toxins, and the toxins are especially being spread in cities. Think of coal dust, smut coming out of the 30 smokestacks from a steel factory. Once we start to create, the petrochemical industry starts to create all kinds of new chemicals, and those are all going into our environments. So it works for capital and for regulatory states to say, no, the body is really dependent on just its genes. The human body gets recoded as hermetically sealed, other than for, dirty water and pathogens, bacterial pathogens. And I think that's something we see culturally too. We start to talk about parts of cities as dirty, as blighted. We start talking about people as a blight on the nation, as dirty, as needing to be cleaned up and reprogrammed and remediated. And all of that, I think, is where we started to go wrong. And so, let's just look at human waste in Washington, D.C. and in Berlin, but let's take Washington, D.C. as an example from the 19-teens. The city leaders and the people who ran Washington, D.C. were members of Congress, and they tended to be self-appointed Dixie Democrats. And they wanted to get Black folks out of the center of the city to the margins. They still needed them as a labor force, but they didn't want them where they were living. So we know this story about racial covenants and zoning practices and loan practices that discouraged Black residents from living in center cities. And so in D.C., people went, and especially migrants moving up from the South in the Great Migration, went to a corner east of the Anacostia River where there had been old farmland that had been exhausted, and they were able to buy tenth of an acre lots. And we find that, starting in the 1920s, families buy not one lot, but from 2 to 6. They set up a tiny house in the middle, and they start gardening around it, and they get some small animals like chickens and pigs. And the city founders invest no money in these neighborhoods. There's no paved surfaces. There's no sewer system. They only put in wells on the streets for running water, for fresh water in the 1940s. And so, here they are, and no garbage pickup. I might have already said that. And so if you want to regenerate exhausted land, as I've already said, it's really good to have a compost stream. And so they take their garbage that's not being picked up. They take the waste from their privies that's could be collected by night soil collectors, or they could use it themselves. And they start building soils by composting it. Just down on that side of the river, too, is the city dump. The company that wins the contract that pays to collect garbage in the city is called the Washington Fertilizer Company. So they collect garbage from all over the city where there is a contract, and they take it to the dump, and there are 300 hogs in the dump that are biodigesting that waste, including night soil waste, and turning it into fantastic fertilizer, which they sell off profitably. And that's just what people are doing in these neighborhoods of Deanwood and Marshall Heights, east of the Anacostia River. And so, meanwhile, Eleanor Roosevelt shows up in that neighborhood in 1936, and she's like, oh my God, this is terrible. Look at these people. They have outhouses, and they live in these, houses built with found materials. We need to fix this situation. But what Eleanor didn't focus on was the fact that her toilet in the White House was belching into the Potomac River. And downstream, it was spreading pathogens. And when you take microbes and you add water, they stay alive. So adding fresh water to microbes rather than having dry composting toilets, as people did in east of the river neighborhoods, is a terrible idea. We still have Washingtonians' waste flooding into the Potomac and the Anacostia rivers to this day. About a month ago, they had a pipe break. You couldn't get near the Potomac River for a week. And so what's the outcome of that? We looked and saw and noticed that at the end of the Great Depression, when millions of white American families, with the help of the New Deal welfare state, have lost their homes. But in those east of the river neighborhoods, homeowner occupancy rates in 1940 were second highest in the city, double that of their white neighbors. And when oral historians went in the 1970s and said, how did you get through the Depression? Did you have jobs? They're like, heck no, you couldn't buy a job. But we did have our gardens, and we ate from them, and we sold off some of the excess, and we were able to pay our mortgages. So what we're talking about is a vegetable-powered wealth that really made a difference in those neighborhoods east of the river. And as we looked through the Recorder of Deeds, we found many, many houses where for 100 years, from 1920 to about 29 to the Great Recession, that families sold their houses for the minimum you could sell your house for, $10. They stayed out of the markets. They passed the houses on to neighbors or to family members rather than selling them in markets that punished Black people. And that was a really smart idea. That kept wealth in the neighborhood. They refused to have white grocery stores. They said, no, we're going to start our own cooperatives. During the Great Depression, they started their own working cooperatives. So women had sewing cooperatives, men had building cooperatives where they took down old buildings and contracted to build new ones. So these mutual aid societies that I think in many ways spring from the activities of healthy soils, where the plants, the microbes, and the fungi are busy exchanging nutrients with one another to create a bounty. So that you always have too many zucchinis and tomatoes. You always have too many seeds. And so gardeners are always sharing as a matter of just existence. And I think that passes on, that bounty, that notion of bounty passes on to human relations in really productive ways.
To hear the full episode, become a patron at patreon.com/deathpanelpod.